Mira que ya viene la revolución, para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
Yo pregunto a los presentes si no se han puesto a pensar que esta tierra es de nosotros y no del que tenga más. Yo pregunto si en la tierra nunca habrá pensado usted que si las manos son nuestras, es nuestro lo que nos dé. A desalambrar, que la tierra es nuestra, es tuya y de aquel, de Pedro y María, de Juan y José. Si molesto con mi canto a alguien que no quiera oír, le aseguro que es un gringo o un dueño de este país. A desalambrar, que la tierra es nuestra, es tuya y de aquel, de Pedro y María, de Juan y José. A desalambrar, que la tierra es nuestra, es tuya y de aquel, de Pedro y María, de Juan y José.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 45, Unmasking Imperialism, exposing imperialist propaganda in mainstream media. Today, two parties, one ideology, exposing imperialist nature of both the Democratic and Republican parties, the two-headed snake, the two-headed beast of imperialism. And during today's episode, we're going to play clips from a recent hearing just a few days ago of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee on Tuesday, November 30th. And the hearing had the stated purpose of examining democracy in Latin America and the Caribbean and the role of the United States. So we know it's all bullshit. We know they are promoting the same nonsense of free market and coup governments and repression. So we're going to highlight how both representatives from both parties are pushing policies that bolster U.S. imperialism. We're also going to talk about the successes of socialism in Latin America and the Caribbean, especially the recent electoral victories for the left, the Chavista movement in Venezuela, the PSUV, winning the regional elections, Partido Libre in Honduras, where my family's from, winning Xiomara Castro, the first female socialist president of Honduras, the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, winning in Nicaragua, and in Chile, more grassroots resistance to the right, the threat of the fascist right with Gast, and grassroots resistance to fascism in Chile. And joining me today is my homie, my comrade out of Jersey, Chris Durán, a student and community organizer working with Free 'em All, New Jersey. And he also works with several other campaigns to free U.S.-held political prisoners and prisoners of war. Chris is a first-year graduate student at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU. I also went to NYU. And later on, we're going to talk a little bit about our experiences as communists in academia and why we think the way we think. And last but not least, Chris told me that he is also an adopted Panther Cub. Shout out to the Black Panther Party for self-defense. In my opinion, the most advanced revolutionary political movement in the United States history. And Chris, how's it going, man? Good to have you back on.
Hey, peace. I'm doing all right. You know, it's December, so finals are coming up, and grad school is whooping my ass, but I'm here. But yeah, all power to the people, free all political prisoners and prisoners of war, free the land, and yeah, I'm very glad to be here.
Most definitely. Shout out to everybody who's watching and listening, by the way, to Deborah Rodriguez, Viva Honduras, and Xiomara Castro de Celaya. Shout out to ILL State Fishing, Viva Xiomara. They also said two sides of the same coin. That's exactly right. Both parties promote imperialism, Democrats. It's like that. I think one of the best memes ever made was like, you ever seen that Lay's potato chip? It's like Lay's wavy and Lay's crisp. It's like Democrats or Republicans. I forget exactly how it's designed, but I feel like it's the same soda. And another analogy I like to use is like Coke or Pepsi, right? It's like you're going to somebody's house and they're like, hey, do you want Coke or Pepsi? Coke or Pepsi? You have to pick Coke or Pepsi. And you're like, nah, I want water. I'm good. Both are poison. Both are soda. Both are horrible for you. And I think that's usually the analogy. Right. I'll have some green tea. I'll have some water, something that's actually good for you. And I think that a lot of times people are stuck in this mindset that the Democrats are left wing. I hear that all the time. People are like the left, the Democrat. I'm like, dude, the Democrats are not fucking left wing. But before we get into it, like I mentioned in the beginning, I have some clips from the recent hearing, the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, some really nasty, disgusting people on that committee who plot and scheme against Latin America and the Caribbean and the world in general, imperialism. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your political awakening, Chris? First of all, were you ever a Democrat? And second of all, what made you become a communist through your political evolution?
So the thing is, like, my political consciousness, I feel like always kind of existed, but without being politicized. So like in middle school and like high school, I was like writing stories about like the U.S. coup in Chile and shit, but like I didn't necessarily understand like how to go about organizing politically around that. Or, you know, in middle school, I was writing essays about Lenin because like my mom grew up in the Soviet Union. So like for me, that kind of stuff was like normal, but like there was no roadmap within the system here in the United States to even understand these kinds of things or even relate to it. So I think in high school, when I started becoming more interested in politics, at first I was a Democrat. I was someone who defended Obama a lot. You know, I was someone who, because to me, like that, I mean, that was like the only other option for me. And so I didn't, you know, there was no other option presented by the system that said, okay, you know, we'll address certain things in a progressive way. And so around my freshman year of college, I started skipping a lot of homework assignments to listen to Malcolm X speeches and read Gaddafi and, you know, all that. I started getting into all kinds of radical material at that point, and I started actually meeting some mentors, you know, luckily that were Pan-Africanists and were into revolutionary politics and so on and so forth. And I got introduced to, you know, Fidel and Hugo Chavez and Che and, you know, everybody. So, you know, that's that. But yeah, I did start out as a Democrat, and I think a lot of people do because they don't see any other option, and because they're, you know, like you said, we are told that is left in terms of normal politics, which, you know, the U.S. pretty much tries to mimic under a framework of fascism.
Yeah, most definitely. And shout out to Howard Saldana. Democrips and Republicans. That's a good one. I've heard Republicrats. That's another one. Two parties, one ideology, imperialism. That's really interesting to know, Chris, about your family that you had family in the Soviet Union. Maybe before we get into some of this, I didn't know that about you. Maybe you can share a little bit more about that because that's pretty unique.
Yeah. So my mom is from Ukraine. Grew up in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic around 1991. Obviously, that started being a different. All the Soviet Union broke apart. What's interesting, my mom is not necessarily political, and yet hearing her experiences growing up with socialism is completely different than what anyone grows up here with. And also seeing what Ukraine has turned into after that is also it's a very stark reminder of what happens when, first of all, you let the U.S. and the reactionaries that they prop up in these countries come into power, and like for example, like she went to college, university for free. She studied theater, so she was into the arts, and you didn't have to be a starving artist in the Soviet Union. You could actually pursue a career in the arts, and culture was valued to some extent. And obviously there are contradictions with the Soviet Union, but like it doesn't, even when we see like these certain situations today, like a lot of times people use these internal contradictions to like justify, oh, they're not really socialist, they're revisionist, all this type of bullshit, and it's like, you're not living in reality.
Right.
Like, you understand if these countries fall, like that's a disaster for like millions of people, and you won't necessarily be affected if you live here in the United States. So
that's really cool, man. That's really cool to hear because to meet people from the Soviet Union and hearing their experiences about the successes of socialism is very beautiful. And I wish I could have been able to see that. IL State Fishing said Gaddafi's son is running for president of Libya. Yeah, hopefully. I think his name is Saif al-Islam. I'm a big fan of Gaddafi. Obviously, with everybody else, some minor disagreements on things, but I think Gaddafi was definitely a progressive, good revolutionary force for Africa. They also said U.S.-led color revolution in Ukraine. The 2014 Euromaidan fascist who put in Confederate flags and Nazi flags into the parliament of Ukraine. Ukraine, that would be an interesting topic to cover in a future stream because I think that's a whole other conversation that is really closely related to Latin America and the Caribbean, the color revolution branding that was done there. But so just kind of kicking off here recently. So it's been a really interesting few weeks because, especially in November, because we had the regional elections in Venezuela where the PSDV, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, won a majority of local gubernatorial seats in Venezuela, meaning that the Chavista government, the socialist government, will be able to continue to advance and build socialism in the country with less opposition or resistance from the right-wing backed forces. Juan Guaido has completely ousted himself as a joke. And right now, I think is one of the most stable and prosperous times in Venezuela. We can remember in 2017, the protests and the inflation was worse. Right now, things are looking pretty good in Venezuela compared to a few years back when the regime change efforts were really high up. So in Venezuela, we have that one electoral victory. We also have on November 7th, the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, the Sandinista Front, leftist socialist government in Nicaragua. President Daniel Ortega won overwhelmingly with over 75% of votes. And also the National Congress of Nicaragua, the majority also stayed with the Frente Sandinista. So again, in Nicaragua, the leftist anti-imperialist movement will continue to be able to construct socialism for at least 5 more years, which is beautiful. In Honduras, Xiomara Castro Zelaya, the wife of former President Manuel Zelaya, who was ousted in the 2009 U.S.-backed military coup that removed him from power forcefully. They kidnapped him in his pajamas. They threw him in the jungle in Costa Rica, some fucking crazy shit. And ever since then, those 12 years, it's been right-wing neoliberal chaos and terror. Very similar, by the way, to what we've seen in Chile under these neoliberal governments of lands being privatized. The same way in Chile, the Mapuche people have been kicked off of their lands in Araucanía by the multinationals. The same thing is happening in Honduras with the Lenca people, where Berta Cáceres is from. the Garifuna people on the northern coast, the Afro-Honduran community. So the people of Honduras have been resisting for 12 years against right-wing neoliberal governments backed by the U.S. And finally, Xiomara Castro Zelaya has been able to emerge victorious in this last election, for now at least, with the Partido Libre, Libertad y Refundación, Freedom and Refoundation. And Xiomara Castro is the first woman socialist president of Honduras, a very big deal for our country. Hopefully she doesn't end up like Bachelet, who I know you probably have some interesting comments about, but I think it's a really progressive, positive sign for the region. Barbados recently became a republic instead of being subjected to the Queen of England. So that's positive news as well. And in Chile, last but not least, even though you have somebody like Gast, a right-wing fascist, somebody who probably is even to the right of Piñera, you have more radicalization, especially with the Constituent Assembly. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what's been going on in Chile? Because you probably have been following that a little bit more closely.
Yeah, so there's a lot. So obviously it's a very complex situation. On one hand, you have the drafting of a new constitution, and you have a constitutional assembly that basically the people elected representatives to, and then they will draft a constitution based off of proposals partly made by civic society organizations and through debate, and then they will put forth a new constitution that the people will then it'll be ratified through a public vote. The head of the Constitutional Convention is a Mapuche woman named Elisa Loncon, and there have been basically measures within the new constitution that sort of have been made to try and guarantee rights for indigenous peoples and indigenous groups. The one interesting thing is that they actually rejected having a delegation of Afro-descended Chileans. So that's one missing part of that constitutional process. But yeah, I mean, that is kind of partially resetting a basis for Chilean society, which is interesting, but it's also like, okay, we'll see where that goes. When it comes to the presidential race, obviously there's a sort of center-left person named Boric, who's running, who represents a coalition of, I guess, what could be called the left. The reason why he is there is primarily because he's more center than the more radical candidates. Obviously, the voter turnout, especially among young people, is pretty low, partially because of a disaffection with voting in presidential elections. And so the person who's leading in the polls is actually his father was a escaped Nazi from Germany. His brother was this guy Cast, his brother was an original Chicago boy, trained under Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago. And so, and he's, said a lot of, racist, really fascist shit, and has a lot of proposals based on that. He visited the United States to meet with Marco Rubio and all the reactionary Latinos here. So that, there will definitely be a contradiction between the new constitutional process, the organizational capacity of, grassroots movements, and the new president, if it stays, the way it looks. So,
yeah, no, most definitely. I've heard about Boris that he's sort of like a social democrat reformist, or he's kind of like controlled opposition. So that'd be kind of interesting to delve into later on, talking about how these methods are applied in Latin America and the Caribbean. What I want to do is I want to start off by playing a clip. This is from Chris, your favorite senator, Bob Menendez, from your home state of New Jersey. I know it's somebody you love and really admire. So that's going to be really great to hear from him. And he's basically kicking off, again, this is from a U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee meeting on Tuesday, November 30th, just a few days ago, after all of the electoral victories, Latin America and the Caribbean. So right now, U.S. imperialism is in a way kind of shitting its pants, thinking about how to re-strategize, how to re-implement imperialism. And it's interesting to note that we have people from both the Democratic and Republican parties scheming together. And it's really in these Senate Foreign Relations Committee meetings that you truly hear just how similar the Democrats and Republicans are in terms of advocating for the free market, neoliberalism, and all this other nonsense with just different creative approaches. So I'm going to play this clip and we're going to get your reaction.
In March, this committee hosted Organization of American States Secretary General Luis Almagro to review the state of democracy in the region. We heard concerns about the uptick in fraudulent elections, shrinking space for civil society and independent media, efforts to politicize judicial institutions, and the loss of hope in a region plagued by insecurity and kleptocracy. While the Inter-American Democratic Charter marked its 20th anniversary in September, the harsh reality is that we are witnessing a fraying of democratic consensus in the Americas. Given Secretary General Almagro's diagnosis, it is critical that the Biden administration continue efforts to restore the defense of democracy as a central pillar of U.S. foreign policy. In his June memorandum, the President made it clear that combating kleptocracy is a U.S. national security priority, and American diplomats are again using the language of human rights. After 4 years of the Trump administration failing to stand up for our fundamental values, we have acutely felt the effects, and these initial steps are welcome. But we must do more, because the truth is that since March, the situation in the hemisphere has become even more challenging. In Cuba, the Diaz-Canel regime attacked, detained, and disappeared its citizens for demanding fundamental freedoms during unprecedented countrywide protests in July. The regime paired physical assaults with internet shutdowns and decrees criminalizing free expression on social media. Terrified of the Cuban people's desire for change, it militarized the entire island to prevent protests in November. While I welcome the administration's 4 rounds of targeted sanctions, we must move more aggressively to hold security forces accountable. And we must launch a strategic effort to demilitarize the Cuban economy in parallel with our support for the Cuban people. In Nicaragua, the Ortega's regime relentless campaign to jail and persecute political opponents, civil society, and independent media resulted in the recent sham elections.
So a lot of nonsense and right-wing garbage and propaganda from Bob Menendez out of New Jersey, a Gusano, somebody who his family is right-wing Cubans, backstabbers to their nation, warmongers, as ILC Fishing says. And one thing I wanted to point before I get your reaction, Chris, is he uses the word kleptocracy. And just to give you all a definition of kleptocracy is wealth-influenced government whose corrupt leaders, kleptocrats, use political power to appropriate the wealth of their nation. And this is a term that has been used by the U.S. imperialists for many years against the global South. And this stereotype, this propaganda that the people of the global South are just inherently corrupt, that these dictators just want to steal all the resources of their region, without mentioning anything about imperialism, how the actual kleptocrats, the actual corrupt politicians in Latin America and the Caribbean are at the behest of Washington, of Wall Street. And he continues to regurgitate this claim that Latin America is just inherently kleptocratic. He also openly mentions that they've been using the, quote, language of human rights to try to advance sanctions. He even says, I welcome the 4 rounds of targeted sanctions, which are completely devastating to Cuba, to Nicaragua, to Venezuela. So it's interesting to hear all of that. Your reaction, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of reminiscent of, so there's a quote where Henry Kissinger was talking about Chile when they elected Salvador Allende, and he was talking about, we can't let a country in South America go communist because of the stupidity of their own people. And it's like this constant like colonial view towards like people of the global South that, we can't control our own politics and we're irresponsible. And if we just have leaders, they're all going to be corrupt. And like, so we have to have the U.S. to manage our democracies and, all this, all this bullshit that, really has nothing to do with how political economic systems are actually set up and have been set up there for 500 years. when you look at Latin America, every single movement for national independence, national liberation, and this also goes for Africa and Asia as well, has been completely assaulted by imperialism as soon as it builds any type of momentum. And so the United States ironically puts all these so-called corrupt people in power. They put the Jovenel Moises in power. They put the they put the Bukeles in power. They put the Piñeras, the Pinochets, these folks in power, and then talk about, oh, look at how corrupt they are. When in reality they're just on the payroll of the CIA, and that's often a thing of people. People say, "Oh, well, you're just using the CIA as an excuse." Like, no, they're literally on the CIA payroll, and there's documents to prove that. You can just look up documents of the past 20 years. It's absolutely true. And if you don't do what the CIA tells you, then you'll still be painted as corrupt, because that's the image of South American politics, or Latin American politics in general, or Caribbean politics in general. But a lot of times it's really not accurate when it comes to the people who are actually resisting that corruption and trying to fight that corruption, and fighting that corruption with socialism, which is the only way that you can fight that corruption. Giving power to the people, giving economic power to the people, giving political power to the people, and making sure that fascists don't have the ability to co-opt that. And then when fascist civil liberties are, mitigated, then they talk about, oh, they're corrupting democracy. And that's what you see with Nicaragua and Cuba and Venezuela and everywhere. So
this is how Bob Menendez wakes up every morning. He looks in the mirror, and this is how he imagines himself dressing up, like Uncle Sam, with his striped red and white pants and a little image of Cuba next to him. This is a political cartoon following the Spanish-American War. Political cartoons are very interesting because even though they were produced hundreds of years ago and we're talking about totally different wars and conflicts, it can really be applied to the 21st century. And on the left, we see a shorter woman on her knees with a curtain or a cloth that says Cuba, and she's brown and she's a Cuban woman, begging Uncle Sam to stay. And behind her, it says famine, pestilence, war, revolt. Everything's on fire. People are dying in the background. And mind you, this is pre-revolutionary Cuba. This is pre-socialism Cuba. So this narrative of like Uncle Sam having to come in and save the day has been repeated on and on since the 1800s. And on the right, you have what the US envisions as democracy in Latin America. It says peace and prosperity. You have oil, and interestingly enough, you have smokestacks polluting the fuck out of the background, which is interesting. That's how they envision peace and prosperity. You have guajiros working, picking the sugar canes. You have industry and sunlight. So this is what Bob Menendez imagines himself looking like every day. And it's really disgusting to see that, because this is something that even to this day is so relevant. And as Deborah Rodriguez says, rogando que el Yankee le da migajas, exactly, begging the Yankee imperialists to give them crumbs of prosperity, of imperialism, when we know that a lot of that accumulated wealth of imperialism is taken, extracted through workers, through enslaved people, through the looting of resources, land, and people. And it's something that people like Bob Menendez, who claim that Cuba is the way it is horrible, and they claim that the US is amazing because of free market capitalism. So it's interesting to see that. By the way, have you ever, he's from your state of Jersey. Have you ever seen him or interacted with him? And what is his relationship like in Jersey? What do the people in Jersey think about him?
Shit. No, I've never personally interacted with him. I don't think he's someone who like tends to be around the people so much, unless it's like Union City or like a bastion of like Gusanos and shit. He gets elected because obviously New Jersey is a Democrat state. It's kind of controlled by that machine, and he's kind of the default candidate for Senate. The only time that I've been anywhere near him was when I did a protest. We did a protest to remove the sanctions off of Iran. So we did a protest at his house in this lily white suburb, Englewood Cliffs or Englewood Heights. I forgot the name of the damn town, but yeah, I mean, he's got a little modest house there, and obviously he's probably got a penthouse in Washington, and his apartments in Miami, and whatever offshore accounts. But yeah, I mean, he's usually the person that people vote for just because that's the default guy. I don't think a lot of people interact with him or are aware of his politics or aware of maybe what's wrong with his politics. Even though he is a consistent warmonger, war, especially by way of sanctions, blockades, if not outright bombing. And so again, when you get into like the whole thing of Democrats advocating war, it's always still warfare. They just decide to starve people through other means besides just sending in the Marines. So
he's the head Gusano. He's the chief Gusano in charge. So you got to go through him if you're
Marco Rubio's sugar daddy.
Marco Rubio's sugar daddy. Marco Rubio's like the junior Gusano. He's still Gusano in training. He's still got to work his way up, But yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people I grew up in New York. I grew up in Queens and in the Bronx and Washington Heights. So it's interesting, like going into Jersey, going into Union City, learning about, quote, Havana on the Hudson and the history of Cuban Gusanos in Union City, in all these other areas, Hoboken and stuff. And it's really fascinating because a lot of the counter-revolutionaries who participated in the Bay of Pigs came not only from Miami, but from Jersey as well. So I find that pretty fascinating. I want to play another clip from your favorite Senator, Bob Menendez, talking about democracy in Latin America. So I'm going to play this and get your reaction.
This month, Congress passed my bipartisan Renacer Act, ushering a new era of international accountability. I'm pleased that the Biden administration is already implementing the Renacer Act with new targeted sanctions and a blanket visa ban on Nicaraguan officials complicit in the dismantling of democracy, the toughest measures Ortega has ever faced. In Haiti, following President Moïse's assassination, gangs now control large parts of the country and kidnap and terrorize civilians, including American missionaries and children. I look forward to hearing how the administration is working to restore security, facilitate dialogue between civil society and political actors, and help chart a Haitian-led path to new elections to overcome this chaos. Since March, the Maduro regime has continued its campaign of torture, disappearances, arbitrary jailings, and manipulation of essential supplies in order to subjugate the Venezuelan people. It has walked away from negotiations with the National Unity Platform, talks that could help address urgent humanitarian needs and set the country on a path towards recovery. Instead, the regime prioritized holding deeply flawed elections that no credible democratic actor has called free and fair. We have observed the surgical deconstruction of El Salvador's justice system as President Bukele appears intent on taking the training wheels off his autocratic project. And in Brazil, President Bolsonaro is plagiarizing the Trumpian playbook by invoking the specter of political violence and fraud in advance of next year's elections. It's no wonder, given the state of democracy in the Americas, that irregular population movements are at an all-time high. Our hemisphere is at a critical inflection point. We must help democracies deliver, especially as they recover from the economic and social impact of the pandemic. We must continue supporting civil society efforts to reverse democratic backsliding. We must help pro-democracy movement harness the power of technology to confront dictatorships. The upcoming Summit for Democracy presents an opportunity to coalesce around a global strategy to confront repressive regimes and strengthen democracies. It's my sincere hope that it produces tangible outcomes. As we said in March, the cost of inaction is too great, and it is increasingly exponentially. When democracies in the Americas fail to provide their people, those looking for a better life will come knocking at the door. And if we do not increase our engagement in the hemisphere, others from further away, China, Russia, will be only too happy to gain a stronger foothold to exploit tensions and divisions.
A lot said there. Crazy, crazy stuff. Deborah Rodriguez said, renacer, the way they use our words in Puerto Rico is promesa. Exactly. And it's very, in a way, satanic, if you want to use that term, how they subvert a beautiful word like renacer, to be reborn, or promesa, promise, and use it for sanctions, for regime change in the case of Nicaragua, promesa in the case of Puerto Rico, for imposing U.S. imperialism, for blocking the island from trading with other nations. Ill state fishing. By the way, thanks for correcting me. I kept on saying ILL state fishing. Ill state fishing, sanctions, war, coups in the name of democracy, disgusting. Deborah Rodriguez said, these fuckers are evil. Yo, that's the best way to put it, honestly. They're like, even Bob Menendez looks like a little demon goblin who just got summoned from the underworld. Ill state fishing said, not a peep about what's happening in Colombia. Exactly right, because it is a client state of U.S. imperialism. U.S. needs to stay out of Latin America and the Caribbean. Summit for Democracy is just a way to keep imperialism alive. That's why anti-populism is imperialist rhetoric, conflating Maduro and Bolsonaro as the same. I think it's good to be critical of reactionary forms of populism, but our enemies will group it all, most definitely. A lot of interesting stuff. One thing that I found interesting is, we know the usual talking points about Nicaragua. Again, Bob Menendez is a Democrat, so that's the kind of interesting part, right? Is that he's not. He sounds like a right-wing Republican in the stereotype of the Democrats and Republicans. Hence, why this episode, two parties, one ideology, U.S. imperialism. You can't even tell them apart. Like, he sounds like a right-wing Republican. We know their usual talking points about Nicaragua, the dismantling of democracy. We know their usual talking points about Venezuela. He mentioned that Maduro's regime is torturing people, disappearing people. Where? Show me that, it's just crazy. Like, he's just saying it and not even citing, like, yo, we have 23 disappearances or this or that. He's just like saying it out of thin air. He's saying that Maduro walked away from negotiations, even though on numerous occasions, the Venezuelan government has been hosting talks and negotiations with the opposition countless times. He says Venezuela prioritizes holding deeply flawed elections. So they admit that they try to do elections, because one of the things that they say is, oh, there's no elections in Venezuela. They have elections all the time in Venezuela. And when they do have them, apparently they're deeply flawed. So complete nonsense. But what I find really interesting, and kind of alluding to what B-Level was mentioning in the chat, is that they're kind of he was also taking hits at people on the right. So, for example, Nayib Bukele, who's the president of El Salvador, who is the first president to allow Bitcoin as legal tender of a country, somebody who identifies with libertarianism, with this quote-unquote invisible hand, with the free market, not a friend of the working class. But he was called an autocrat. So that's really, I don't necessarily disagree with that. But coming from Bob Menendez, that's really interesting, right? The fact that he took hits at Bolsonaro, Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, as playing from the Trumpian playbook, so comparing him to Trump. And that I found really interesting. So he's kind of taking hits at both sides, which I think the Democrats tend to do a lot. It's like they'll punch the left really hard, and they'll do a few little soft hits at the right to try to make it seem like they're balanced. But Chris, your reaction to everything that Bob Menendez was saying?
So he said a lot. He kind of went through a full list of like naming every enemy of the United States, and then also like naming. It's funny, they do a thing. It's like now they like kind of play off of the history that they created. So they play off of like the fascists that they put in power, like Pinochet, and all these folks throughout Latin America talking about disappearances and all this type of shit. And it's like, you funded this shit for years, and now they're using that to show, to kind of like, again, use that caricature of the Latin American leader. And again, they pull the folks like Bolsonaro, who is the obvious fascist, and say, oh, he's just like Trump. And it's the same kind of tactic that they use here to like make the excuse for Biden. It's like, oh, he's not Trump, but like he's gonna do the same exact shit as Donald Trump. in essence, on principle, like the politics are not really different. It's just like the way they go about it. And but yeah, I think one of the things that really like stuck out, like first of all, like that Renacer Act, putting like this sort of blockade on Nicaragua now is, they're trying to double down now that they have Biden on these so-called anti-democratic regimes. First of all, with Nicaragua, as you've covered, like about 6 opposition parties ran, and the only people that they limited civil liberties for were the people who directly got funding from the CIA, like the Chamorro family, like, people who directly like sponsored coup attempts and murdered people for the last several years. That a lot of so-called independent media outlets like Democracy Now! Provided cover for. And so it's funny, like you see these coup attempts and you can read about them in history and break them down, for example, with Chile. But in real time, like you can also see it happening. And if you pay attention to certain left media outlets, you'll see how they get funding from the United States. So Nicaragua actually had a very, much more open election than arguably the United States, or some of the more, powerful democracies in the world. So that whole charge is a bunch of bullshit, and you can't really look at it, unless it's in the context of the 2018, coup attempt. You can't look at that, you can't look at any socialist government in general, unless it's in the context of U.S.-backed regime changes. I mean, when the U.S. political economy controls the entire world, you can't necessarily expect for any country to operate outside that existence, even if they call themselves socialist now. It's not like they're suddenly outside of the realm of the United States. So yeah, that's a bunch of bullshit. The thing on Haiti is so laced with hypocrisy. It's fucking amazing. And excuse my language, but it's disgusting. Like, the United States destroyed democratic elections in Haiti for years. They supported Papa Doc and his son. They killed, they supported, CIA-backed gangs in Haiti to kill communists and socialists and so on. For years they tried to subvert the Haitian Revolution. Before that, and when it comes to like Jean-Bertrand Aristide, he was elected president twice. A leftist who was elected president twice when they first had democratic elections again after Baby Doc, and the U.S. backed the coup against them. And a lot of the left, the so-called, anti-revisionist left, supported that as well, and enabled that as well. The folks who think that they're more purely socialist than others,
right,
and that they're not doing socialism correctly and all this type of bullshit again. And then in 2004, George Bush literally sent in the Marines, kidnapped this man, dropped him in the middle, in Central Africa, very similar to what they did to Zelaya. Like, they literally kidnap world leaders. And, so again, that blatant disregard for like reality. And then all of a sudden the U.S. is a friend of democracy. I'm pretty sure Bob Menendez had to have some involvement with the Haitian coup as well, in his long ass fucked up history. And again, like with Maduro, like you said, like they're a lot more open to the opposition than what some people on the left would even want them to be. Because honestly, like folks like Guaido, like some of these fascists, like should not actually have the opportunity to influence politics, because they will destroy everything that Venezuela has gained since Chavez took power, and since the Bolivarian Revolution took power, or got a foothold on power. Because again, the struggle for power is a never-ending one. You actually have to combat imperialism on a continuing basis. It's not like you just get the presidency and then like, okay, everything is now it's a whole socialist program. Like, no, you're in a constant struggle, and I think that's the whole thing when getting back to understanding, the whole science of revolution, the whole thing of dialectics. You got to get back into understanding like it's a constant struggle for revolution. So and the one thing that I'll say last is just on the OAS. So when he's relying on this OAS report on democracy, the OAS is basically a U.S. monitored international organization for Latin America. which is amazing that the U.S. should have any seat or say over Latin America given its history. And yeah, when they're talking about the only observed elections, by international organizations, most international organizations approved of the elections in Venezuela year after year after year. The only ones that seem to have a problem with it are the European Union and U.S. delegations. So.
Most definitely. And I'm glad you mentioned Haiti. I think Haiti is another great example that's not really mentioned when we're talking about Latin America and the Caribbean. Perfect example of how both the Democrats and the Republicans subvert an island nation. I want to share a pic with you. This is me and former President Aristide. I got a chance to meet him in 2019. Yeah, 2019, when I was in Haiti. I was covering some of the protests that were going on. I was tired as fuck, sweaty as fuck. So excuse me if I look busted as hell, but it was a really cool experience, man. I got to talk with him for at least like an hour, and we were talking about all the bullshit that the U.S. has done in Haiti. We were talking about how the Democrats and the Republicans have initiated regime change. He was removed twice in military coups in Haiti in 91 and also in the early 2000s. And he is somebody who, for many years, has been trying to advance poverty, get rid of poverty in Haiti. Haiti has been the most impoverished nation in the Western Hemisphere for many years and has been forced to pay reparations to France because of its liberation from colonization. The Haitian movement, the Haitian people are so revolutionary, and that spirit of 1804 continues. And it was beautiful being able to speak with President Aristide about the long history of Haiti. And he is somebody who's brilliant. He is somebody who is so inspiring to me. And just meeting him, talking with him, and just his political consciousness of being like, yo, the Democrats and the Republicans, like, they're both fucking whack. Like, they both have fucked up our country. They were both involved in the coup in Haiti. It was a really cool experience. So, I just wanted to share that, because I think you hit on something that's really important, because a lot of times people in the West, they try to like Monday morning quarterback, what I like to say, or they try to like LARP and be like, if I were the president, I would immediately do this. Like, no, like you have to, once you're on the left and you're trying to build socialism or lift people out of poverty in your country, you're confronted with all these problems. Any little thing you do will be branded as authoritarianism, as being a kleptocrat, and being all these horrible things. So speaking with Aristide about that was really beautiful to get his perspective on. Also want to share this article. Shout out to Comrade B Level, by the way, who mentioned that we should take a look at this article. The bad guys are winning, and Applebaum on the rise of autocratic power around the world. So some fucking shitty journalist from The Atlantic has a piece about what she describes as the rise of autocratic power. And this is the cover of The Atlantic, an imperialist magazine. It says the bad guys are winning, and it has Maduro looking grumpy as hell. Let's see if we can. Maduro looking grumpy. Lukashenko in Belarus, who's like checking his watch or something. Putin, Xi, and Erdogan in Turkey. I'm definitely a fan of the dudes on the four dudes on the left. Erdogan, I'm like, whatever. I don't really vibe with his governance, but it's just interesting the way they're framing it. How a new league of autocrats is outsmarting the West. And this is exactly what they were talking about in that Senate Foreign Relations Committee meeting, because they talk about how the myth of liberal democracy and all this nonsense is not working anymore. And there was one interesting thing, that paragraph from this article that they mentioned that's kind of interesting. Applebaum writes that the language of NGOs and the narrative power of what used to be called the free world, previously important tools for democracy, no longer work, because while American diplomats and their allies can condemn the ways these autocrats stay in power, in part by intimidating, jailing, or torturing dissidents, today's autocrats don't care about their international reputation. Their goals are money and power. They are not concerned deeply, sincerely, profoundly, or otherwise about the happiness or well-being of their fellow citizens, let alone the views of anywhere else. That sounds like they're talking about the U.S. So it's a phenomena that's really interesting and really fascinating to talk about when we're talking about what they say, the rise of illiberalism. So what I want to do is I want to play a clip. This is from Idaho Senator James Risch, who's a Republican, again spouting imperialist propaganda about Latin America and the Caribbean. So I want to play this, Chris, and we're going to get your reaction.
The United States has had an enduring interest in a stable and prosperous Western Hemisphere, and the democratic order is the best guarantor of those things. The people of Latin America and the Caribbean have made great strides toward democratic governance over the last several decades. However, it's disheartening to see how quickly that progress can be lost. Nicaragua joins Cuba on a seemingly bottomless descent into authoritarianism. Within less than a generation, Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro have turned Venezuela into a failed state. Last year, candidate Biden promised to use smart sanctions and greater multilateral pressure on the Maduro regime. 10 months in, President Biden has not imposed a single sanction on the regime or any of its cronies. And the European Union is not any closer to matching the economic and diplomatic pressure brought forth by the United States and Canada. Equally concerning is the negative effect of malign state actors such as China and Russia. China's predatory economic practices are a formidable threat to the sovereignty of countries in the Western Hemisphere. The adoption of technologies developed and controlled by firms vulnerable to Chinese Communist Party pressure undermines privacy and human rights. Russian disinformation campaigns exacerbated the protests that rocked democratic countries in South America in 2019, including Colombia, Chile, and Ecuador. Putin openly endorses increasingly authoritarian rulers with the goal of destabilizing the region and threatening its security. And Russia's export of repressive laws and practices to its allies in Latin America allows authoritarian leaders to suppress independent media, civil society, and political opposition. Lastly, criminal and foreign terrorist organizations are malign threats to the safety of both our communities here at home and democracies in the region. The administration's plan to remove the FARC from the foreign terrorist list undermines U.S. national security and democratic stability in Colombia. As this administration plans for its upcoming Summit for Democracy next month, I'm glad to see numerous countries from the region invited. I hope this summit is more than just a ceremony of words and hollow promises, and instead will produce real results to improve democracy and rule of law across the region.
That guy looks like if I showed up at his front porch, he'd pull out with his shotgun and be like, "The fuck you doing here, boy?" Like, I feel like he would just shoot me on the spot. And from Idaho, Senator James Risch, who is, you can tell, like, probably is a Klan member by night, and really disgusting. Let me just read some of the comments. B-Level said, "Smart sanctions." Very interesting comment there. Very interesting point. Very true. Smart sanctions. So I guess the previous sanctions were dumb sanctions, but that's the way that these imperialists talk. You know, they efficient sanctions. Shout out to Richie, by the way, one of my good comrades, fraternity brothers from the Bronx. Everything U.S. politicians say is a projection of their own actions. Indeed, exactly right. It's gaslighting. It's an abusive relationship. Everything that U.S. imperialist media says is the complete reverse. Everything that they do. Howard, Assad should be on that red page. Otherwise, they'll say he goes, then it backfires. That's right. The Assad curse. U.S. is a hypocrisy empire. Shout out to Nadir. IL stay fishing. Meanwhile, NED funding extremist reactionaries all over the world. Exactly right. And Deborah Rodriguez saying facts. Shout out to everybody watching and listening. Thank you for checking out the stream. One thing before I pass it to you, Chris, that I found really interesting is Senator James Risch. He couldn't even say the name correctly of the Venezuelan president. I don't know if you noticed. He was like, President Nicolas Chavez. Like, he couldn't. It's first of all, he didn't even call him Nicolas Maduro. He later on he said the Maduro regime. He's like, President Nicolas Chavez. I'm like, yo, at least get his fucking name right, bro. Like, he doesn't even take the time to do the research to understand who he's slandering, saying Nicaragua is joining Cuba on the list of authoritarian regimes. And he's saying, interestingly, he says Putin is backing authoritarian rulers. And he was also talking about what he described as criminal foreign terrorist organizations like the FARC, which have been resisting empire, which have been resisting paramilitary death squads and are not terrorists, but in fact are freedom fighters defending Black and indigenous peoples. So a lot there. Chris, your reaction to that clip?
Yeah, it's funny how FARC is now like a terrorist group. They're literally like guerrillas that were trying to like fight for liberation in Colombia. So, it's funny who they decide to call terrorists and who they decide not to. Usually folks who are terrorists tend to be on the CIA payroll. They don't call the white helmets terrorists, or, any of the folks that they support in Syria or in Russia or in Belarus for that matter. It's funny. They're talking about Putin supporting these authoritarian. I don't think Putin supports them enough.
Right, exactly.
He doesn't support them more than the Soviet Union did. So he could be doing a lot more. But again, that country. Again, the irony of that fact that Russia is a country that's been so fucked up by U.S. imperialism for like the last few years. It's that after the Bolshevik Revolution, they immediately invaded that country and then put sanctions on them for years. And then as soon as it fell apart, they wanted to be a part of the NATO. And when Putin took power and tried to get some kind of national sovereignty, then they have a problem. It's just, again, it's very ironic. Again, I don't know who this senator is or who this dude. I've never heard this man in my life. He looks like he goes outside and he yells at squirrels during the daytime.
Right. Get out of here.
I don't know what he does with the rest of his like daytime, but he's a creepy looking dude. I don't know. It's just so funny the way that they talk about authoritarianism and democracy. So again, from a Marxist perspective, any political system is authoritarian by nature. A revolution is authoritarian by nature. You're trying to suppress. Oh, Jesus Christ.
Dude, he looks like he just crawled out of a coffin. He looks like a fucking demon.
He looks like one of those like claymation things that they use. Those cartoons that come around at Christmas. He looks like a miser or some shit. Like he.
Oh my god.
Oh shit.
Yeah.
Where is his teeth? Man, looks like his three front teeth are shaven down. And he got vampire fangs on the other side.
Dude, he's a vampire, bro. At night he comes out and he drinks baby blood. Yeah, man, it's disgusting. All these people are like, that's the thing. Like something that the face of democracy said, Camarada Chuy. Exactly. That's the thing. Like that's the.
That's a much more handsome face on democracy. I'm just saying.
Right.
My doodle's a much more handsome face on people's democracy.
Exactly.
Than, it's funny because authoritarianism is like authoritarianism in the name of who? In the name, which class is going to be in power? Which class is going to, have power over that so-called democracy? Is it going to be the liberal class, the class of compradors and reactionaries in Latin America, the folks who are based around the United States, the imperialist capital, of the world, or is it going to be the workers, the peasants, the indigenous people, who is going to control that democracy? Democracy is a measure of people, the people's power, and liberal democracy is, it'll always fall short. And unfortunately, because of the assault by imperialism, that's the only reason why revolutionaries take that path of even trying to seize power through liberal democracy, like the Chavistas, and so they're trying to deal with the problems of corruption and all this shit in their country through that path. And, again, adopting a sort of idealistic look, again, critiquing left here in the United States, adopting an idealistic sort of look doesn't work. And for obviously, from the conservative, from the right, they won't like anyone who gets into power at all who, espouses a socialist program. And so then they'll just throw out all the rules of like liberal democracy. The thing is, there's a brilliant quote by Fidel when he's talking about Chile and Allende, when he's talking about, as soon as a revolutionary people come to power through liberal democracy, they'll throw it all out and resort to fascism. And you see that every time. That's how Bolsonaro is even in power. That's how his predecessor got there. So, and again, the idea of like privacy and private property equaling human rights. I feel like China might have a better grasp on democracy than the United States. So
yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because something that I'm sure you're familiar with, being previously in academia, studying political science and all that in college, they always create a false dichotomy. They say it's capitalism versus versus authoritarianism, or they'll say democracy against socialism, when one is a political system and another is an economic system, and they totally conflate the two. Like you can have a socialist democracy, and also under revolutionary socialism, it's what Lenin described as the revolutionary proletarian dictatorship, where you have the ruling class is the working class, and among the working class you have a direct democracy, but that working class exercises a dictatorship over the bourgeoisie, not having to negotiate with them and telling the bourgeoisie what to do. So I think it's just interesting how they use wordplay to try to create spells and make it seem like it's different. Deborah Rodriguez says Maduro's stash is classic. Most definitely. I think Maduro, one thing that as B-Level mentioned, like this is Maduro just chilling, like dancing salsa, having a good time. And as B-Level said, notice how the genuine smiles are of communists. You don't see that on capitalist stooges. They don't have the love for the people. Exactly. Think about all the shit that Maduro has been through: coup attempts, assassination attempts, destabilizing the economy, everything. You name it, everything has been thrown at him. Yet he still is able to have life, have a human being. And you look at some of these capitalist, imperialist people from the West who, it's just, they look like demons. So one thing I want to do, Chris, is I have one more clip. This is from an exchange between State Department Rep Brian Nichols and Democrat Chris Murphy, where they talk about the difference between Trump and Biden in regime change. So I'm going to play this clip, get your reaction, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for your work and for coming before the committee today. I think it's safe to say that President Trump's policy towards Venezuela was a failure. The administration essentially decided to push all of our chips to the center of the table on the first hand, recognizing Guaido ahead of many of our allies in the region and assuming that that would lead to the immediate collapse of Maduro's regime. That's not what happened, and there was no plan B. So we were sort of stuck for the next 3 years. So you have a lot of work to do to put together a policy that actually effectuates American aims in the region. On the question of sanctions, I just want to probe this with you a little bit more, Secretary Nichols, because there's certainly a case to be made that our sanctions can be effective, that they can weaken Maduro, that they can punish bad actors. But there is, of course, a flip side. There's a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela today. There's a report from a few years ago suggesting that our sanctions have dramatically reduced caloric intake, increased disease and mortality, and had a number of other really serious and potentially catastrophic effects on the Venezuelan people. It also has the potential, our sanctions do, to provide fuel behind the anti-Americanism that is essential for Maduro to hang on to power. So I've supported these sanctions because there's no shortage of individuals in Venezuela who deserve them. At the same time, there are humanitarian consequences, and there frankly isn't a lot of evidence over the course of the last 4 to 5 years that those sanctions are actually weakening the Maduro regime. And so let me ask you about how you view both the upside and the downside of our existing sanctions policy and the prospect of additional sanctions.
Thank you, Senator. The sanctions are an important tool in our quiver, and as Assistant Secretary Robinson said, it's also important to have other tools that we can use to both induce positive behavior and to dissuade people from taking improper actions. We need to work to balance and leverage all of those tools to the greatest extent possible. I think the suffering of the Venezuelan people owes much more to the horrible policies of Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, which destroyed the economy, the healthcare sector, food production, retail sector, and some 6 million Venezuelans have voted with their feet to leave that country. So it's, I think those are the root causes of the suffering in Venezuela. But I also believe firmly that a negotiated process between the unitary platform and the Maduro regime is the best way forward, a process led by Venezuelans themselves, and we should be flexible and creative in supporting that process.
We should be flexible and supportive in creating that process. So a lot of interesting stuff there. Chase, Phil in game said that all looked like vampires to me. That last guy looked like he didn't even want to be there. He was like, "What the fuck?" He just like remembered the talking points. He's like, "Yo, what the fuck am I doing here? Like, I really don't give a fuck." Ill Stay Fishing said 60 years of Cuban sanctions, and these disgusting people want more. Do these guys actually believe anything they say? Yo, for real, it's like it's complete parody and nonsense. And in a way, they're kind of talking in code because at the beginning, this Democrat, Chris Murphy, the white dude who was like, oh, sanctions, they're bringing so much suffering. But then at the end, he's like, but I support sanctions. So he's like admitting that even though sanctions are leading to the deaths of people, of innocent families, because food, medical supplies, and other essential items are not able to enter the country, that it fucks up the economy. And he admits that it fucks up the economy, creates a humanitarian crisis. But then he says he supports it. And he was like, in talking about the Guaido attempted coup, he says, there was no plan B and we were stuck for 3 years. So it's just interesting. And then he also says sanctions grow anti-Americanism and they're essential for Maduro to hang on to power. So in a way, like, we're seeing U.S. imperialism brainstorm new methods as we speak, as we hear them talk. And it's just interesting to hear these conversations because these are the sorts of conversations that between the Democrats and the Republicans, they get along with. It's like that expression, we're all friends after 5 o'clock after work. They're all buddies. They all support the same agenda. So that was really interesting. Chris, your analysis of that.
Yeah, I think so. There are really like two quotes that really I just want to throw out there real quick, just because there's one by Julius Nyerere, who was the president of the first independent president of Tanzania. He talked about the United States is also a one-party state, except with typical American extravagance, they have two of them. And there's another quote. I think there was a speech that Raul Castro was giving, and he was talking about with an American diplomat after they opened up some kind of relations with Obama, and he was saying. The American diplomat was criticizing Cuba and said, "Oh, you have a one-party state," and Raul says, "So do you?" And he says, "No, like we have the Republicans and Democrats. We have two." And he said, "That's correct, but that's like saying that I have, there's two parties in Cuba, and I run one, and Fidel runs the other. Like it's one family, for them." So I found that really interesting too. So this dude Murphy, see, that's the
United States is also one-party state, but with typical American extravagance, they have two of them. Yeah. Yo, that's like the quote of the day right there. Shout out to this legend, Julius Nyerere.
Yeah, so I mean, if the capitalist class, provides the political content of the party, then that means that it's one political class, and in essence. So like this dude Murphy, I think he's from Connecticut. So he's listing all, and this man must have like some weird, fucked up psychological problems in his head, because he's literally acknowledging the fact that sanctions have destroyed the lives of Venezuelan people, but then saying they deserve it again because of their leaders. They're people like Maduro, and it's like you guys, if you sanction people in the government, that's gonna fuck up the people too. And also they don't, and they're lying because they're not just sanctioning Maduro, they're sanctioning the economic sectors of the country. So they're blatantly lying. They're sanctioning the ability for them to go and trade with other countries, and that's exactly what they do. Have done to Cuba for 60 years. And so this dishonesty, and again they're saying, oh, it stokes anti-Americanism. And so I think that's the thing, that when you say, like, do they believe what they're talking about? I think they really do, because again, they buy into this American crap. Like, is stoking anti-imperialism, anti-Americanism is the same thing. Is stoking that belief, really bad for the majority of people in Latin America and the Caribbean? We were talking about Barbados becoming independent. How soon until the U.S. is going to try to swoop in and control their republic? So I mean, again, the support for sanctions as like the framework of discussing foreign policy is counter-revolution. It has no consciousness of the fact that these conditions were created by neoliberalism in the first place. That's how Chavez came to power, and the people supported Chavez, that they loved him and put him back in power when the United States tried to coup him back in 2002. And they've won overwhelmingly in elections, with the Chavistas. Like, even the past election, they won 20 out of 23 districts, I believe, in Venezuela. And, again, it really goes down to the fact that, once you get past all this rhetoric of democracy and human rights, it's a struggle for power. It's a struggle of whether, the majority of the people in these countries have power, which will be through revolutionary fronts, or whether the United States will have power, which will be through the reactionaries, through these liberals, through the people talking about democracy, and a democracy in a way that's like, oh, well, let's just have fair elections, but like let's rig it in a way that the socialists, somehow can't win, because then they'll be authoritarian, but somehow, the liberals won't be. And when it goes, the point, when we talk about brainstorming for like imperialism, I think I talked to you earlier in this week, but there's a panel at NYU actually where they set up.
Tell us about that.
They had multiple faculty members at the university talking about basically the same thing. So they're talking about elections in Latin America, but from the framework of supporting the opposition in countries where they had socialist governments. And they didn't mention once U.S. involvement in any of these countries. How the stated goal of these sanctions are to destroy the conditions of these countries, to force regime change, and somehow that's okay, and somehow that's supporting democracy. But again, like, the framework is always, okay, how do we get rid of Maduro? How do we get rid of the Castro government or the Ortega, whatever? And but you can see in real time, like, how the Chicago Boys came to be. You can see in real time, like, how these ideas are talked about here in academia, in political circles, in think tanks, and then they're exported through foreign policy to Latin America. And then you see their running dogs everywhere throughout the elite circles. They're, crafting this policy. And then we all talk about, oh, why are these countries so corrupt? Why are these countries, why is Mexico supporting anti-immigration policy? It's like, well, because a lot of the government is run by fucking proxies, and it's done deliberately over the course of decades. And it's not, so, and you can see it in real time if you just pay attention to U.S. politics. And that's the thing about empire, is that when you pay attention to what happens in the core, then you'll see why things happen in the so-called periphery. So,
well said. No, definitely. And that's something that Marx talks about in the process of abstraction, which in the dialectical materialist understanding is like, abstraction is like taking a photo. It's like, within capitalist logic, what they do is that their analysis of a particular phenomenon in society, they'll take a photo and they'll isolate something from its surrounding, and they'll only explain what's in the photo and not what led up to the photo. So, for example, mentioning Venezuela, the rise of the Chavista movement, the rise of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, Chavismo, and I think George Chicariello Mayer explains this in his book We Created Chavez pretty well, that Chavez was a response to neoliberalism. Chavismo was a response to capitalism, to colonialism. It's not like they woke up out of nowhere and they're like, we're going to terrorize and destroy Venezuela. You know, it doesn't work that way, right? Same thing with China. The Chinese Communist Party was a response to the century of humiliation, of imperialism, of the opium wars, of Britain, UK, France, US, all these imperialist powers selling drugs and opiates in the region and making China the sick man of Asia, as they used to call it. And the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Revolution, was the Chinese people standing up, as Mao Zedong said. The Chinese people have stood up. So socialism is a reaction and response to the oppression of capitalism. And that's something that within the Marxist ideology of abstraction is something that is not really mentioned. So I think that's such a great point that you were mentioning about how they use this sort of logic and framework to frame things. Just wrapping up here, Chris, it's been really dope talking to you, by the way. Just wrapping up here, like I went to NYU for my master's. You are at NYU now. So we're both, I'm used to being in academia. You're in academia now. One of my biggest pet peeves with academia or disagreements was that if you were in any way communist or leftist or anti-imperialist, you are marginalized. I felt that way. You're branded as like an apologist for the Maduro regime. You know, it's just like, so that those spaces in academia and higher education are framed in a way that support imperialism. So I wanted to get your analysis. Like, what has it been like? Like you talked about that webinar, for example, that where they had all these imperialist apologists talking about Latin America. Like, what advice do you have for especially younger people who are politically active like us, who are conscious, who are anti-imperialist and communist, and want to study politics in college and stuff like that, but are weary of a lot of the imperialist propaganda being pushed in higher education today?
I think a lot of that actually, it's funny, I asked that question because I was getting real frustrated. I asked that question to Dr. Jared Ball, and he answered, just keep your grounding in like organizing spaces and spaces where they're actually organizing for the people. They're organizing around issues of, food security, the food security, political prisoners, folks who are actually on the ground. And even when you're in academia, trying to organize, with your peers for issues that affect them, and trying to, ground them also in a politics that has to do with like political prisoners, that has to do with the world around them, and not just the academic setting. I think one of the things that really has gotten me frustrated, and I've voiced it in some of my classes, that, we talk about certain ideas, but like we talk about, we're decolonizing and all this type of shit. I was like, we're sitting literally like in NY, in the middle of fucking New York, talking about decolonizing. Nobody here is, or very few people are actually working on the ground anywhere, unless it's with maybe like an NGO or some shit, and no shade to their work, but sometimes like it needs to be a little bit more grounded in people's needs, and with genuine relationships and political ideology that can be grounded in the people. And I think that, I think for anyone who's in academia, like who's worried about these types of politics, try to, get involved with politicizing your peers. Try to get involved with like connecting what you're doing to what's going on the ground. I mean, in New York, for example, there's a huge, there's movements against, for example, for closing Rikers Island. There's movements to free political prisoners. There's movements, to provide food security. And if you're going to talk about decolonizing, if you're going to talk about prisons, if you're going to talk about all these types of progressive things in liberal colleges, you should try to connect them to what's going on the ground, and also try to organize the students against what might be injustices within the academy, because you'll have a lot of racist ass professors who have a lot of power. And a lot of your ideas that you talk about that are progressive don't actually have power in academia. And so as students, you should organize for power. And that's the one thing that I'm glad that a lot of students in places like Latin America, in places like Chile, that they have realized that they have, if they organize, that they have power over that institution. And that's why, like, for example, when I was in college, I was involved with a student movement to gain power for Black and brown students. And I'm glad that there's those movements being covered now across the country in places, like Howard and, different high schools around the country and so on and so forth. And that left media that are now popping up, such as yours, Anti-Conquista, Orinoco Tribune, Black Power Media, that they're covering these movements because they are very important. And the students do very much have a role in them and do very much have a role to play class suicide and join these grassroots movements.
Well, it's definitely, man. I couldn't agree more. When I was at New York, when I was living in New York, I live in Cali now, I live in LA. But when I was at NYU, I spent very little time at NYU at the campus. I couldn't stand a lot of these pompous, arrogant, liberal NGO people. And I would spend most of my time in the hood, like in Harlem or in Brooklyn or all over, and organizing, especially the anti-war stuff. The Syria stuff was big at that time. I was attending a lot of the Hands Off Syria rallies in 2013, 2014. So definitely, man, I couldn't agree more. But it's been a pleasure, man, speaking with you. I hope all is well. And is there a way that people can follow you or support the work that you do?
Yeah, so I think that there's I shout out a few people, but so Freemal NJ is on Instagram. My Instagram is Chris Durán 97. Obviously, try to if you're trying to keep up with a lot of these topics, follow Black Power Media on YouTube, Instagram. Follow Ramiro. Follow your channel on here.
Follow PragerU. No, I'm playing.
And also follow or visit the National Alumni Association of the Black Panther Party online. They have a lot of links to donate to various political prisoner causes, including Sundiata Acoli, and they're looking for more young people to get involved with their efforts as well. And they're also on Instagram as well. So,
well, Zeph, comrade, I really appreciate having you on. Again, we spoke with Chris Durán, student community organizer working with Fremont, New Jersey, and other political prisoner campaigns and political prisoners of war. Chris is a first-year graduate student at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU, my alma mater, and also an adopted Panther Cub. Shout out to the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Shout out to all revolutionary movements in the global north, resisting imperialism. Deborah Rodriguez said, "Pa'lante mi gente, not PragerU." Yeah, I was just fucking with you. I don't work for PragerU. But yo, I hope you guys have a great week. Chris, you too, man. I look forward to having you on soon, bro. Shout out to everybody who's watching and listening. And we're going to go out to some revolutionary music by Grupo Mancotal from Nicaragua, Tributo a Sandino. Peace out, everybody. Have an amazing week and talk to y'all soon.
Mi causa es la causa de mi pueblo, la causa de América, la causa de todos los pueblos oprimidos.